Have you ever come out of a daydream to realize you were driving? That you had ended up somewhere that requires making turns and stops, but you can't really remember making those turns or stops. You just suddenly realize, holy shit, I'm driving. Well, that's how it started. I was on my way home from college for the holidays. It was a drive I had made half a dozen times at this point. So naturally, I had become pretty familiar with the road. My mind was somewhere a million miles away when I finally noticed the road ahead of me. I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel. I had been gripping it like a vice. The clock on my dash read 12 a.m. How long had I been driving on autopilot? I tried to remember, but my mind felt so groggy. The last thing I could remember was flying down the road, jamming out to Paranoid by Black Sabbath. Now, though, nothing looked familiar. I was seriously tired. I needed to stop and get an energy drink or something. I looked further on up the road, but beyond the headlights was just pure blackness. Hopefully there would be a gas station or something within the next few miles. I seriously needed a pick-me-up. After a few more miles, and no sign of civilization, I began to wonder where the hell I actually was. I should have been on Highway 9, which was the last stretch before I made it back home. At least that's where I thought I should have been. But the farther I drove, the longer the empty darkness went on, the more convinced I became that somewhere along the way I had made a wrong turn. I reached into my pocket for my phone, but it wasn't there. Confused, I began to search around the inside of my car, but all I could see was a few discarded food wrappers and a half-drank bottle of Gatorade. I decided to pull over and search for the little black dependency brick. I had never been very navigationally inclined. Honestly, I think I depend on Google Maps entirely too much, but right now I didn't care. I was lost and needed directions. After about 5 minutes of scrounging around under the seats and between the center console, I realized my phone was gone. I had no idea where I had lost it. Maybe I had left it back at my dorm, or maybe it fell out of my pocket somewhere. I didn't know. The only thing to do now, I guessed, was to just keep on driving and hope I find somewhere to stop and ask for directions. I reached down to turn up the radio, but was met with only silence. I sighed. The radio in my car had crapped out on me a while back, and I thought I had fixed it. Apparently not well enough, though. The next hour or so of driving was going to be mind-numbingly dull without tunes. I glanced down at the clock on the dash and sighed. Oh great, I thought. Now the clock is busted too. The numbers still showed 12 a.m. I shook my head. Baby, I love you, but you have some serious issues. My car was my pride and joy, even if she had seen better days. A 1991 Camaro RS, it was white with red racing stripes. The paint job was custom but had seen better days, not to mention that the radiator was held together with JB Weld, and it had over 200,000 miles on the engine. Needless to say, the old girl could use some TLC, that is, when I could afford it. I shrugged off my worries about the time and the radio and kept on driving. Eventually, up ahead in the distance, I thought I could make out a faint light. As I drove on, the solitary beacon grew brighter and brighter, a lighthouse shining in a sea of night. After what felt like miles and miles, the light finally resolved into a bright neon sign. The sign had a long green snake looped around fiery red words, "The Midway Saloon." I pulled into the parking and thought it looked about like any other dive bar I had ever seen. There were a handful of classic cars and Harley-Davidsons parked out front, but the thing that stood out the most was standing there, hitched to a post, staring at me. It wasn't too unusual to see horses at bars. This was the South after all. But this horse was different. It was absolutely massive, solid black with a gleaming black saddle. The way the big animal's eyes reflected the light almost seemed to make them glow. I parked next to an old Cadillac and stepped out onto the gravel lot. The warm air seemed to grow cooler under the giant horse's gaze. It watched me all the way to the door, the glow in its eyes never faltering. Stepping through the saloon doors, I was met with the familiar smell of cigarette smoke and spilled beer. A jukebox in the corner played a song I had heard at least 100 times, but for some reason I couldn't place it. The patrons played pool, darts, and leaned against the bar talking loudly. The bartender looked up from behind the bar. He was a big guy in a crisp white shirt and rolled up sleeves. He had a bushy beard and dark slicked back hair. He put down the glass he had been cleaning and met my eyes.
New around here, huh? Well, what can I get you?
I nodded. Yeah, actually, I'm just passing through, but I'm not really sure where here is. He smiled and shook his head.
Passing through. That's a good one.
I sat down at the bar and ordered a beer. So, I'm trying to get to Highway 9, but I think I made a wrong turn somewhere. Could you tell me how to get to where I need to be? The bartender shook his head and sat the beer in front of me.
No, I can't tell you that. I can tell you, however, you are a long way from where you want to be.
What does that mean? I asked. The big man just smiled and went back to cleaning the same glass. I glanced around the bar, noticing the way the people were dressed. It was like some crazy decades party or something. In one corner, I saw a guy dressed like a 1950s greaser, playing darts with a guy who looked like a 90s punk rocker, blue mohawk and everything. At the other end of the bar sat what looked like a Wall Street banker talking with a couple of Civil War reenactors. You all having a costume party or something? I asked the bartender. He just smiled at me again and continued cleaning the glass. I shook my head and took a sip of my beer. Glancing around the bar again, I noticed a man sitting alone in one dark corner. He had a long black coat and a wide-brimmed cowboy hat. Is that the guy who owns that beast of a horse out there? I asked, motioning to the man. The bartender stopped cleaning the glass as the bar went silent. I could feel every eye in the room fixed on me, almost every eye. I looked around at the people surrounding me, then to the back of the room where the man sat alone. His dark hat tilted up as he looked at me. He had the same cold glow in his eyes I had seen in the horse outside. I felt a chill run up my spine and my skin grew hot under that gaze. He didn't just look at me. He looked into me. It was like he could see down to my soul, to the very fiber of my being. I felt panic rising from nowhere. Just then, I felt an iron grip on my arm. I turned away from that unnatural gaze and looked at the bartender.
You had best be on your way, son.
I nodded and stood up from the bar. Which way do I go? I asked. His face took on a grim countenance.
Just keep following the road.
I nodded. What do I owe you for the beer? Smiling warmly again, he said,
First one's always free.
I frowned at that, and he went back to cleaning the glass. As he did, the commotion of the bar resumed, as if it had never stopped. I stepped out of the strange saloon and avoided looking at the horse as I made my way back to my car. I just needed to get back on the road and away from whatever the hell that was. Pulling back onto the blacktop, I quickly left the Midway Saloon far behind me. I had been driving for what felt like hours at this point. Where the hell was I? How could I have become so lost? Just then, I saw something up ahead in the distance. At first, it was just vague dark shapes against more darkness. But as I got closer, the shapes resolved into buildings and houses. It was a town. As the town came into focus, my exhausted brain caught up with what seemed so out of place. It was a town with no lights. What the hell? The road I was on led right down the center of the dark town. As I slowed down, I looked from side to side at the buildings lining the street. The buildings looked old, made of dark red brick and wood. But they weren't run down or abandoned, just empty and dark. There were streetlights, but none of them were on. I didn't see any other cars in the town either. Come to think of it, I hadn't seen any other cars all night. I pulled my car to a stop at the center of town and rolled down my window. The sound of my car's engine reverberated through the town. It seemed so incredibly loud in the utter emptiness. I killed the engine and stepped out onto the dark, empty road. My headlights were still on and out of the corner of my eye. I thought I saw something move out of the beam. I turned to look for whatever or whoever was there, but I didn't see anything. Hello? Hello? I shouted. The echo of my voice bounced around and distorted before going silent. After a moment more of silence, I began to get back into my car when I heard it. Hello? Hello? Goosebumps rose on my skin as I whipped around, looking for the answering voice. the voice that sounded almost exactly like mine. My eyes scanned the darkness, but I couldn't see anyone. This was wrong. This place, it felt wrong. I couldn't understand it, but I felt eyes on me from every direction, just like back at the bar, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" I whispered under my breath. The moment stretched as the silence of the town seemed to swallow the sound of my voice. "Hello?" a voice whispered back. I spun and jumped into my car, my heart pounding. The voice had been right behind me. I could swear I felt a warm breath on my neck. I frantically rolled the window up and looked around for the voice, but there was no one there. I reached for the ignition and turned the key, but the damn thing wouldn't start. Suddenly, a street light at the end of the block started flickering on and off. Standing directly under the light was a man. I couldn't make out many details at this distance, but what I could see chilled me to the bone. His clothes hung on him like rags, and his skin looked cracked and dark, like charcoal. He stood there crookedly, staring at me. When the light flickered back out, he was gone. I could still see the darkened street light, but the man had disappeared. He was just gone. I turned the key again and again. "Fucking come on!" I shouted. When the street light flickered back on, I could see the man again. Only this time, he wasn't alone. There was at least a dozen charred figures standing under the light now. They jerkily moved and shifted towards me as the light flickered. "Fucking come on!" they all shouted in my voice. I watched in horror as they broke into a run just as the light flickered back out. Finally, the engine roared to life and I slammed it into gear. As I tore through the dark town, my headlights illuminated dozens more charred figures. Their skeletal hands reached out for me as I blazed past them. I could hear their nails scratching into my car's paint as I passed them by. I accelerated faster out of the town and back onto the long dark road. My head was spinning. They weren't real. They can't be real. I could barely see straight. I briefly thought about heading back to the Midway, but I couldn't stop. Real or not, I had to get away from that town. I had to keep driving. The only problem was, I could no longer tell how long I have been driving. Time seemed strange. I stared down at the gas gauge and prayed it was broken also. I couldn't remember how long I had been on half a tank. The road and the endless darkness beyond it seemed to stretch on for eternity. After another indeterminate time of driving, trees began appearing sporadically along the sides of the road. Eventually, they grew in numbers, until both sides of the road were heavily forested. The road began to twist and wind. What was once a long, straight stretch of emptiness was now a serpentine path through towering trees and woodlands. I was truly lost, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around, to face those things in that town again. When I came around the next curve, I slammed hard on my brakes. Right in front of me was a large old iron bridge. My mind raced. This was the first time the road had deviated from being anything but blacktop. I shook the feeling off. It was just a road, a very long, uninhabited road. I stepped out of my car and looked around at the surrounding forest. It was so quiet. There should have at least been animal noises, right? Crickets, owls, coyotes, something. But there was absolutely no sound. I walked toward the old bridge. I wasn't sure it would be safe to drive across. I needed to get a closer look before trusting it to hold. My footsteps echoed through the forest as I stepped up to where the asphalt met the wooden planks of the bridge. I stared down. The dark, pristine asphalt gave way to rotted-looking wood. I cautiously extended my foot and placed it down onto the wood. The step seemed louder than it should have been and echoed down into whatever was below the bridge. It seemed sturdy enough, so I walked out onto it, testing the structure by jumping up and down.
"Is someone there?"
I froze. It was a woman's voice, and it came from under the bridge.
"Hello, is someone there?"
she called. I turned as quietly as I could, began to make my way back to my car. The voice wasn't a mimic of mine this time, but I still didn't trust anyone who hung around under bridges. I made it 3 steps before the boards creaked under my step. The woman's voice came again.
"Hello? I need help, please, I'm hurt."
I swallowed hard. The voice sounded sincere. What if it was someone like me, lost on this road and trapped down there? How could I just leave her down there? I decided to take a chance. Hello, I'm here. Where are you? The voice sighed in relief.
Oh, thank God. I'm down here under the bridge. I fell off and my leg is pinned under a rock. Can you please come down and help me?
Okay. Let me go get a flashlight from my car. Is there a path down I can use to get to you?
Yes, I can see a path down. Just follow the sound of my voice.
I hurried to my car and grabbed a heavy maglite from my trunk. Luckily, the batteries were still good, and I was able to find the path that led below the bridge. Okay, I'm coming.
Please hurry, I've been down here so long. No one would stop to help me.
I was halfway down the path and paused. You've seen other cars on the road? I asked. The voice was silent for a moment. Then she said,
Please hurry, it hurts.
1 minute, I said. I think I have a first aid kit in the car. I'll just run and grab it really quick.
No!
The voice shouted in anger before softening again.
Just come a little closer. I can see your light. You're almost there.
From where I was standing, the bridge blocked my view underneath it. But if I knelt down, I would be able to see. Slowly, I bent down and shined my flashlight across the rocks under the bridge.
That's it,
said the voice.
A little farther.
I panned the light to the left and saw a scrap of dirty white cloth. I stepped forward, looking closer. The cloth was part of an old stained dress. The woman's body lay brokenly among the rocks under the bridge. She looked like she had been dead for some time. When my light shined on the woman's face, she smiled. Her smile spread wider and wider, and her eyes took on a manic excitement.
You found me,
she said before bending straight up at the waist, her joints cracking like old kindling. As I began to back away, she leapt to all fours and darted toward me. I turned and ran as fast as I could up the hill and back to my car, my heart pounding. I could hear her right behind me, her hands and feet scrambling across the ground like a deranged spider. Just before I made it to my car, I felt an impact on my back. She was on me, biting and scratching. I fell to the ground and rolled across the road, throwing her off of me. I jumped to my feet just as she lunged at me. I leapt back and swung the heavy maglite, striking her in the head. She recoiled in pain and fell to the ground, sobbing.
Please don't hurt me. I just needed help,
she cried, holding her hands up in defense. I stepped back in confusion. What? You attacked me, I shouted.
No, I just needed help and you hit me,
she sobbed. I shook my head. I'm not doing this, just stay back and I'll leave. I stepped back away from her to my car and opened the door. I only took my eyes off of her for a second and suddenly, she was on me again, slapping the flashlight away and knocking me to the ground. She dug her nails into my shoulders and chest as she tried to bite my face. Her eyes bulged and her teeth were impossibly large and jagged. I couldn't push her off of me, so I wrapped my hands around her neck and squeezed as tightly as I could, fear and adrenaline running through me. I squeezed my eyes closed and kept up the pressure until finally she slowly stopped fighting and went limp. I flung the body off of me and looked at it in horror. In death, she just looked like a normal woman, dirty and beaten, but normal. And I had killed her. I bent over and puked, disgusted and horrified at what I had just done. I had to get out of here. As I turned to get back into the car, the dead woman behind me started laughing. Looking back at the body, I could see she was still laying there, the toothy smile back in place, but her eyes were completely vacant.
Please don't hurt me,
she laughed. My breaths came quicker and quicker. What the fuck are you? Her head turned to face me as her smile spread even wider.
I'm what you will become.
In an instant, she was back on her feet and wrapping her hands around my neck. I felt my feet leave the ground as he squeezed my throat, tighter and tighter. I choked and kicked, but I couldn't break free. Her jaw unhinged and stretched, revealing row after row of jagged, serrated teeth. I couldn't believe it. This was the end, and I didn't even understand what was happening. Just as consciousness started to fade, I heard a boom, like a thunderclap as a flash lit up the sky. I fell to the ground, choking and gagging, one of the woman thing's arms still holding onto my throat. I managed to pry it loose and looked up to see the stunned look on her face. Another boom lit up the sky, and a burning hole appeared between the thing's eyes just before she crumpled to the ground in a pile of ash. I stood and looked back up the road, but I couldn't see anything. I heard him first, heavy footsteps accompanied by the jingle of spurs. Then out of the darkness, a pair of cold, glowing eyes. He was coming, and I wasn't waiting around to see what he wanted. I just needed to get the hell out of there. I jumped over the smoldering ash pile and into my car. I stomped on the gas pedal and tore across the bridge, praying I would find a way off of this fucking road. As I left the forested area, I pressed the accelerator even harder. The needle on the speedometer rose to 85, then to 100, then 120. I put the pedal to the floor and screamed out all of my fear, anger, and frustration. Time and miles passed in a haze. I never stopped. Several times I came to places on the road where someone or something wanted me to stop. A tree in the road, a hitchhiker waving for me to stop, another rickety bridge. None of it mattered. I had to keep going. I'd swerve around or drive over whatever was in my way. My car took a beating, but she never stopped. I saw the horseman a few more times. I think he even chased after me once. I didn't care, I just sped on. Whatever this place was, it had an end somewhere, a way out, or a way back, or something. I just had to keep driving. I suddenly woke up in the parking lot of a cafe. Glancing around, I saw several cars in the lot and a big sign out front that said Al's. Through the window, I could see several people inside sitting and eating and going about their business. Had it all been a dream? Yeah, of course it was a dream. A long, terrible dream. I stepped out of my car and made my way to the door. I felt groggy and exhausted. That way you do after a restless night of sleep. I pushed open the cafe door and heard the bell jingle. Sitting at the counter, I motioned to the waitress and she came over.
Hey, hun, what'll it be?
I smiled up at her. I could use a coffee. She nodded.
Coming right up.
Setting a white mug on the counter, she filled it to the brim with the steaming beverage. I inhaled the aroma and smiled. I couldn't believe I was finally out of that nightmare.
You don't fucking belong here.
I looked up at the waitress. Excuse me?
I said, do you want sugar with that?
She said, grinning down at me. I blinked in confusion. No, I don't. The waitress smiled and nodded before turning back to the kitchen. I must still be a little out of it, I thought. Shaking my head, I took a sip from the mug and immediately spit it out. The coffee, it tasted like I couldn't even bring myself to think it. I looked down at the mug and felt my stomach drop. What had just been a cup full of dark warm coffee was now filled to the brim with a dark red liquid that smelled like copper and rot. I stumbled back from the counter, gagging and knocking over the stool, as the cafe erupted into laughter. I looked around at the cackling faces as the vile liquid in the mug began to pour over the brim and continued flowing out onto the floor like some macabre fountain. No, I was still on that fucking road. Just as I was about to turn and run for my car, every single person in the diner stood up as one and turned to face me. The laughing stopped and their smiles were replaced with an expression of pure hatred. Then they began to speak. A trucker in the corner.
You're a unique one.
The waitress behind the counter.
We don't get one like you here often.
A little girl in a booth.
Not nearly often enough.
An elderly man at the counter. The halfways always. A young woman at the register.
Taste.
The cook by the flat top. So. A mother of 3 by the door.
Much.
All as one.
Sweeter.
I stood there, petrified as the moment stretched. I have to get out of here now. I ran for it. I was going to shove and punch and kick every single one of these fuckers out of my way if I had to. I didn't make it past the first one. It was a middle-aged, balding man who looked like he weighed maybe 120 pounds. I tried to shove him and run past, but his skin was like one of those sticky mouse traps, and my arm got immediately stuck against his face. I tried to rip myself free, but the others began closing in around me, their hands reaching out to take hold of me. I could feel dozens of hands sticking to me and pulling from every direction. I didn't know what would break first, my body or my mind. I screamed in fear, and the assembly howled in joy. Just as I thought I would be ripped limb from limb, Thunder boomed through the diner over and over again. The tacky hands began falling away, and I collapsed to the floor. As I lay there trying to catch my breath, I felt a different set of hands of me. Large, ice-cold hands. I felt myself being pulled to my feet and dragged through the diner and out into the parking lot. As I was thrown to the ground, I looked up at my savior and winced under the glare of those eyes. This was the closest I had seen him, and it was horrible. His skin was pale and sunken, like an aging corpse, and his white hair hung in strands down to his shoulders. He glared down at me and pointed one long finger.
"Stay."
His voice was deep and gravely, full of both age and power. He turned and started back to the diner, pulling 2 massive revolvers from his belt. Through the window of the cafe, I saw the corpses climbing to their feet. Most of them had large chunks missing from their bodies. One after another, the bodies began falling into each other. They clumped together in a fleshy, gore-coated mass, arms and legs and mouths jutting out in all directions. The mass began shifting its way to the door. All of the thing's eyes were still fixed on me. The pale gunslinger kicked the door open and began firing both thundering revolvers, knocking the thing back and blowing off massive chunks of smoldering flesh. I didn't stay to watch the rest. Even though he had saved my ass twice now, he still filled me with a kind of dread that was all-consuming. I jumped to my feet and ran around the massive black horse between me and my car. I cranked the engine to life and floored it away from the cafe and on down the road. I kept driving and driving and driving. Time lost all meaning. I never got hungry, never got thirsty, never stopped driving. I believed that I had found my way to hell. My suspicion was confirmed hundreds of miles later, when I saw a bright neon sign up ahead in the distance, the Midway. I stood there on the gravel lot, staring up at the sign, the glow of the neon painting the night in shades of red and green. Only now could I see the snake for what it really was, an Ouroboros, the paradoxical serpent forever eating its own tail. There was no end to the road, no end, no beginning, just an eternal loop of misery and darkness. I stared at the sign, my eyes following the coils of the snake around and around. My mind cracked even further and I began to laugh. I doubled over and fell to the ground laughing harder and harder, and for a while I just slipped away. I don't know how long I lay there like that. After a time, I came back to myself. Sitting up from the cold ground and climbing to my feet, I made my way to the door and pushed through it. The bartender looked up from wiping down the bar top.
"Back so soon?"
I numbly walked over to the bar, sat down on a stool and met his eyes. I have been driving for days, maybe even weeks. I can't even fucking tell anymore. The bartender nodded.
"Weeks, months, years?"
My eyes had dropped to the bat top but shot back up at his words. Had it really been that long? He noticed my panic and chuckled.
"They're just words. They don't really mean anything here."
"So, is this hell?" I asked.
"No, it ain't hell. It's just the road."
I shook my head in confusion. "But what is the road?" The bartender studied me for a moment before answering.
"Well, some have called it purgatory or limbo, but it ain't really that either. This is the traveler's road. It's where the lost souls of travelers end up."
My heart dropped. "So I am dead."
"Not entirely. I couldn't see it before, but there is still a thread of life within you."
"Wait, what? I'm still alive?" He shrugged again.
"Partially. Your life is in the balance as we speak. I reckon that's why the rider has such an interest in you."
"Why would that interest him? What is he?" I asked.
"What he is, I don't rightly know. Around here we just call him the rider. What I do know is that he is a hunter. He wanders through all worlds and finds things that don't belong and removes them. You not being fully dead don't fully belong here, so he isn't quite sure what to do with you."
I thought about the woman from the bridge and how he reduced her to a pile of ash. Would that be my fate? I didn't think so. He had his chance to end me on the road. Instead, he protected me. On the road there were things that tried to kill me. He nodded.
"The unnaturals. Vengeful souls that died of unnatural or supernatural causes. They feed off of pain and fear.
I swallowed a lump in my throat and asked, what would have happened if they killed me? His face turned grim.
Then you would stay here and become one of them.
I shuddered thinking of the people in the diner. Were they lost souls too once? I didn't think I wanted to know the answer. If I die, will I stay here? He smiled sadly.
I wish I could tell you you'd move on, but I don't know. My guess is that since you wound up here in the first place, this is where you'll be.
I shook my head. But why?
Kid, I still don't know why I'm here. Some people do move on from the road, but not many and not often. It's one of life and death's great mysteries.
Just then, I heard the snorting of a horse from outside, followed by heavy, spurred footsteps. I turned to face the door just as it swung open. As the rider entered the bar room, the temperature dropped. I felt goosebumps on my skin as I stood and met his gaze. Thank you, I said, my voice trembling. I took a steadying breath and started again. Thank you for helping me. He stared down at me with that terror-inducing gaze. The moment stretched, but I didn't look away. Eventually, the rider gave a small grunt and a nod of his head before turning and heading to his seat in the back of the bar. I turned back to sit back at the bar when I felt myself growing increasingly dizzy. My vision began to blur and I spun and fell to the floor. For a moment, all I could see was the dim bulb hanging from the ceiling. But then the bulb grew brighter and brighter, until all I could see was a blinding white light, and my ears were filled with a deafening ringing. Eventually, I was able to make out a distant voice.
Hey kid, can you hear me?
I tried to speak, but I had no voice.
If you can hear me, follow the light.
I did, or at least I tried to.
Good,
said the voice.
Can you tell me your name?
I blinked over and over again. My eyes were so dry.
Hey, I think he's coming out of it.
The voice was calling to someone else. Reality slammed back into place. I was on my back with a flashlight in my face, surrounded by paramedics. I turned my head to look around. Someone told me not to move, but I had to see. My car was wrapped around a tree about 20 feet away. What time is it? I asked. The paramedic leaning over me looked down at her watch and said,
12:01.
I felt tears burning in my eyes. I was alive.
You must have been having some dream,
said the paramedic as I was loaded into the ambulance.
You were talking about bars and monsters and gunslingers.
I smiled, despite the pain I was in. Yeah, some dream. I'm just glad it's over. It was a dream, wasn't it? That's what I tell myself anyway. It had to be a dream. The heavy, jingling footsteps I heard as they closed the ambulance doors were just in my head, weren't they?